May 10th, 1945, a shattered road junction somewhere in western Czechoslovakia, where the burned-out hulks of German trucks still smoldered and the smell of cordite hung in the spring air. A Soviet colonel stood watching American tanks of Patton's Third Army idle at the agreed demarcation line, their crews lounging on the hulls, smoking cigarettes, waiting for orders that would never come. The colonel turned to his political commissar and laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal. "Look at them," he said in Russian, nodding toward the Americans. "They could roll to Prague in 4 hours. Instead they sit and wait for permission like schoolchildren. Their general wants to fight us. We've heard the reports, but his masters have leashed him." He spat into the dirt. "Cowboys with no stomach for the next war. They'll go home, get soft, forget how to kill. When the time comes, we'll own this continent, and they'll be too slow to stop us." Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. Every week we uncover the stories the world forgot. What the Soviet colonel didn't know was that 60 miles west, in a commandeered German headquarters that still smelled of leather and old cigars, the most aggressive battlefield commander in American history was pacing like a caged tiger, drafting cables that would make him radioactive, assembling intelligence that would get him relieved, and pushing his superior, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, toward a confrontation that could have rewritten the second half of the 20th century. George S. Patton Jr. wasn't just angry about stopping at the demarcation line. He was convinced that the wrong enemy had been defeated, that the real war was about to begin, and that America's refusal to strike immediately would cost millions of lives over the next 50 years. And standing between Patton's fury and a third world war that nobody wanted was Eisenhower, the diplomat general, the coalition manager, the man who'd learned to balance egos and armies across 2 years of brutal campaigning. This is the story of how Ike stopped Patton from lighting a fuse that would have incinerated Europe. The specifications of the confrontation weren't measured in calibers or armor thickness. They were measured in divisions, logistics, and political will, the math of what it would take to fight the Red Army in the summer of 1945 versus the math of what America could sustain. Patton's intelligence staff had been compiling the numbers since April, when Third Army and Soviet forces linked up at the Elbe. 12 million Red Army soldiers were deployed across Eastern Europe, exhausted and hollowed out but still massive. They held 6,000 tanks, mostly T-34s and heavy Joseph Stalins, dug into defensive positions from the Baltic to the Balkans. Their air force, rebuilt with American Lend-Lease fighters and bombers, numbered 8,000 aircraft. On paper, it was a steel tsunami. But Patton's G2 officers saw the cracks. Soviet logistics were a catastrophe. 60% of their fuel came from American convoys, 70% of their trucks were American Studebakers, and their supply trains in Poland and Germany looked like something from the Napoleonic Wars. Horse-drawn wagons, ox carts, soldiers marching on foot because there was no fuel to move them. "Cut the Lend-Lease pipeline," Patton told his staff, and the Red Army is immobilized in 2 weeks. Their tanks become lawn ornaments. He wasn't theorizing. His officers had seen it with their own eyes during the link-up. Soviet tank columns stalled on the side of roads, crews scavenging German fuel depots, entire divisions waiting for supply trucks that never came. The Red Army was a giant running on fumes and American charity. Against this, the United States had 3 million men in Europe, the most powerful air force ever assembled, complete air superiority, a logistics network that could deliver 10,000 tons of supplies daily, and after August 1945, the atomic bomb. Patton's plan, sketched in fury across maps in his headquarters, was brutal in its simplicity. Strike north and south simultaneously, cutting off Soviet salients in Germany and Czechoslovakia, use massed air power to destroy rail hubs and fuel depots, and dare Stalin to fight a mobile war his logistics couldn't sustain. Estimated casualties: 200,000 Americans in 6 months. Estimated result: Soviet forces pushed back to the Polish border, Stalin's prestige shattered, Eastern Europe liberated before the Iron Curtain could descend. Patton presented the outline to Eisenhower in a meeting on May 12th at Supreme Headquarters in Frankfurt. Ike listened with the patience of a man who'd spent 2 years managing Patton's brilliance and recklessness in equal measure. When Patton finished, Eisenhower set down his pen and said 6 words that ended the discussion. "George, we just fought one war."
But Patton wouldn't let it die.
The training that had shaped him since West Point was all about decisive action, about recognizing the moment when the enemy is vulnerable and driving the blade home. He'd studied Grant's relentless Virginia campaign, Stonewall Jackson's maneuvers in the Shenandoah, Sherman's march to the sea, lessons in how to destroy an enemy's will by destroying their ability to fight. He'd learned it again in North Africa, where hesitation at Kasserine Pass had cost American lives, and speed at El Guetter had saved them. He'd perfected it in France, where his Third Army had torn across the countryside faster than supply lines could follow, living off captured German stocks, proving that momentum itself was a weapon. The doctrine Patton believed in was simple. War is killing, and killing is a math problem. You solve it by maximizing your advantages and exploiting the enemy's weaknesses before they can adapt. In May 1945, he saw the equation clearly. America had every advantage. The Soviets had fatal weaknesses, and the window was closing. He wrote to his wife, Beatrice, "We may have to fight the Russians. If so, now is the time to do it, while our army is intact and the Red Army is still bleeding from the German war." It wasn't bloodlust. It was calculation, and it terrified everyone around him. The first vignette that revealed the depth of the crisis came on May 14th, during a meeting between American and Soviet liaison officers near Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Donnelly of Patton's staff was coordinating the handover of German prisoners when a Soviet major began demanding that the Americans also turn over thousands of Russian POWs, Red Army soldiers who'd been captured by the Germans and didn't want to return to Stalin's tender mercies. Donnelly refused. The Soviet major's face went cold. "Your general thinks he can challenge us," he said through a translator. "We know what Patton says about the Red Army. Tell him we are not impressed. We buried the Wehrmacht. We can bury you too." Donnelly drove back to headquarters and reported the exchange verbatim. Patton listened, stone-faced, then walked to the map on his wall and stared at the Soviet positions. "They're telling us who they are," he said quietly, "and Ike won't listen." The second vignette was darker, more personal. On May 17th, Patton visited a displaced persons camp near Landshut, Bavaria, where thousands of Polish refugees huddled in tents and shacks, afraid to go home because the Soviets had arrested the Polish Home Army leaders who'd fought the Nazis alongside the Allies. Patton walked among them, a translator at his side, and listened to stories of NKVD raids, disappearances, executions. An old man grabbed Patton's sleeve and asked in broken German when the Americans would liberate Poland. Patton had no answer. He walked back to his jeep, climbed in, and sat in silence for 10 minutes while his driver waited. Finally, he said, "We promised them freedom. We're handing them to another set of killers." That night, he wrote in his diary, "I wonder if we are not preparing for the wrong war. Our enemy was Germany. Our problem is Russia. If we don't solve it now, our children will have to, and it will cost them more." It was prophecy wrapped in rage. Eisenhower understood the rage, but he also understood the impossibility. Ike had spent the war building the coalition that crushed Germany, managing Montgomery's ego, placating de Gaulle, keeping Churchill and Roosevelt aligned, and, most delicately, maintaining enough trust with Stalin to prevent the Soviets from signing a separate peace with Hitler. He was not naive about Soviet intentions. British intelligence had been feeding him reports of NKVD atrocities in Poland, of Soviet obstruction in planning the final assault on Berlin, of Stalin's territorial ambitions. But Eisenhower also knew that the American public was exhausted, that Congress was already demanding demobilization, that mothers across the United States wanted their sons home, not dead in another war they didn't understand. He knew that Truman, president for barely a month after Roosevelt's death, was trying to establish legitimacy on the world stage and couldn't afford to be seen as a warmonger. And he knew that the United Nations, the dream of a post-war order built on cooperation rather than conquest, would die before it was born if America turned on its ally the moment Germany surrendered. "I don't get to decide this, George," Eisenhower told Patton during a heated exchange on May 20th. "Truman decides. Marshall decides. The American people decide. and they've decided they want peace. But Patton kept pushing. He began authorizing his intelligence officers to interrogate captured Wehrmacht officers about Soviet tactics, Soviet weaknesses, Soviet supply lines. He ordered his logistics staff to keep detailed records of Soviet movements, calculating how long it would take to mobilize for offensive operations. He quietly instructed his division commanders to retain German POWs who'd fought on the Eastern Front, filing them under administrative holds, just in case. He didn't order the rearming of German units. That myth grew later, but he floated the idea in private conversations, testing reactions, imagining scenarios where German soldiers, who knew the Red Army intimately, could be used as auxiliaries in an American offensive. His staff was horrified. His corps commanders were split. And Eisenhower, receiving reports of Patton's activities through the chain of command, realized he had a crisis that had nothing to do with the Germans. The upgrade that could have made Patton's plan feasible arrived in August, after the war in Europe was already over. The atomic bomb. When news of Hiroshima reached Patton in Bavaria, he saw it as vindication. "That's the weapon that ends this," he told an aide. "One bomb like that on a Soviet tank concentration, and Stalin sues for peace." He began lobbying quietly through channels, sending memos to the Pentagon arguing that atomic weapons made a conventional ground war unnecessary, that 2 or 3 strikes on Soviet marshalling yards or command centers would break their will without requiring a mass mobilization. It was coldly logical. It was also politically insane. Truman had authorized the atomic strikes on Japan to avoid a bloody invasion and end the Pacific War. Using them preemptively against an ally, even a rival ally, would have destroyed America's moral authority and turned world opinion against the United States overnight. Eisenhower knew this. When he heard about Patton's memos, he called him directly. "Drop it, George. I mean it. You're done talking about the Russians." Patton's response was silence. "Then, someone has to say it, Ike." The range of Patton's advocacy extended beyond military planning into something more dangerous: public statements. In May, during a press conference in Regensburg, a reporter asked Patton about future relations with the Soviet Union. Patton grinned, a shark's grin, all teeth and no warmth, and said, "The Russian has no regard for human life and is an all-out son of a bitch, barbarian and chronic drunk." The reporters laughed nervously and scribbled. Patton kept going. "They're not like us. They're Asiatics. We're going to have to fight them eventually. The only question is when." The story hit American newspapers 2 days later. Eisenhower read it in his office and felt the air leave his lungs. Truman, trying to negotiate post-war borders with Stalin at Potsdam, was blindsided. Marshall, in Washington, called Eisenhower and said one word: "Control him." Ike tried. He issued a direct order: no more public statements about the Soviets. Patton agreed. He lasted 3 weeks. In September, Patton gave a speech to occupation troops in Bavaria where he called the denazification program a waste of time and compared Nazi party membership to being a Democrat or Republican in America, just people trying to get along. When reporters pounced, asking if he was soft on Nazis, Patton snapped, "The Nazis are finished. The real enemy is the communists, and we should have killed them when we had the chance." Eisenhower had run out of patience. On September 28, 1945, he relieved Patton of command of the Third Army, the army Patton had built and led from Normandy to the heart of Germany, and reassigned him to a meaningless paper command overseeing military history. It was a public humiliation. The man who'd been on the cover of Time magazine, who'd broken the siege at Bastogne, who'd crossed the Rhine faster than any Allied commander, was now shuffling papers in an office. The official reason given was Patton's comments about denazification. The real reason, understood by everyone in the chain of command, was that Patton had become a political liability that threatened Allied unity and Truman's foreign policy. Ike didn't want to do it, but he had no choice. Patton took it like a gut shot. He wrote in his diary, "They've relieved me for telling the truth. The Russians are the enemy. Everyone knows it, but no one will say it." He spent the next 2 months in his new command, bitter and isolated, drafting memos that no one read, giving interviews that got buried, watching as the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe solidified into permanence. In November, he wrote to a friend, "We've won a great tactical victory. We've lost a great strategic war. In 10 years, we'll be fighting them anyway, and it will be harder." He was composing his own epitaph, and he knew it. The enemy respect for Patton, ironically, was strongest among the Soviets he wanted to destroy. NKVD intelligence files, declassified in the 1990s, show that Stalin's spies tracked Patton obsessively in 1945, filing reports on his movements, his statements, his state of mind. A memo from NKVD chief Lavrentiy Beria to Stalin in June 1945 reads, "General Patton remains the most dangerous American commander. He advocates immediate war against the Soviet Union and has the operational skill to threaten our forward positions. Recommend continued surveillance and political measures to neutralize." The political measures included leaking Patton's most inflammatory quotes to sympathetic Western journalists, amplifying the perception that he was unstable. The KGB, successor to the NKVD, later admitted that Patton's relief in September was celebrated in Moscow. He was the only one who understood the correlation of forces, a retired KGB officer said in a 1992 interview. If Eisenhower had listened to him, the history of Europe would be different. We were not ready for another war. The industrial reality behind Patton's plan and Eisenhower's refusal was a tale of two military machines in vastly different conditions. The United States in 1945 was producing war material at a rate that still defies comprehension: 18,000 aircraft per year, 30,000 tanks, 2 million rifles per month, enough ammunition to sustain a multi-front war indefinitely. American factories were undamaged, American workers were experienced, and the logistics network could move supplies from Detroit to the front lines in Germany in 2 weeks. Pilot training programs were graduating 5,000 aviators every month, each with 200 hours of flight time, more than most Luftwaffe aces had when they entered combat. The U.S. Navy controlled every ocean. The Army Air Forces could launch 1,000-bomber raids at will. It was a machine built for total war, and it was still running at full capacity. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was a smoldering ruin held together by coercion and American aid. 27 million dead. 1,700 cities destroyed. Factories dismantled and shipped east to the Urals during the German invasion, reassembled but never as efficient. The Red Army's vaunted production numbers, 60,000 tanks, 40,000 aircraft during the war, masked the fact that most were low quality, rushed through production with minimal testing. Soviet pilot training in 1945 averaged 60 hours, barely enough to solo, let alone fight. The comparison was devastating. An American P-51 pilot with 200 hours of training and a reliable aircraft versus a Soviet Yak-9 pilot with 60 hours in a plane that might have engine failure on takeoff. Patton knew these numbers. He knew that if the United States committed to total war against the Soviets, the industrial imbalance alone would decide the outcome. But he also knew, and this is what haunted him, that America would never commit. The will wasn't there. The public support wasn't there. And without those, the industrial advantage was irrelevant. The final boss Patton wanted to confront wasn't a weapon system or a specific enemy unit. It was an ideology backed by 12 million men and the political will to use them. Stalin's Red Army in the summer of 1945 was the largest ground force ever assembled, and while Patton correctly assessed its logistical vulnerabilities, he also understood that sheer mass had its own logic. The Soviets had won the Eastern Front not through tactical brilliance, but through attrition warfare refined to an industrial art, feeding divisions into meat grinders until the Germans ran out of bullets, then doing it again. Against the Wehrmacht, which was already exhausted and surrounded, that approach worked. Against the United States Army Air Forces, with total air superiority and atomic weapons, it wouldn't. Patton's assessment was that Soviet armor, concentrated in defense, could be fixed in place by American infantry while fighter bombers tore them apart from above. The T-34s that had terrorized German positions were vulnerable to P-47 Thunderbolts carrying rockets and napalm, vulnerable to tank destroyers with high-velocity guns, and catastrophically vulnerable to aircraft delivering atomic bombs. Their strength is numbers, Patton wrote in a tactical memo to his staff. Numbers don't matter when you can kill 1,000 men in a single flash. It was accurate.
It was horrifying.
And it was the kind of thinking that made Eisenhower realize Patton had crossed a line from aggressive to apocalyptic. The operation that could have served as Patton's mic drop moment. The proof of concept that American forces could shatter Soviet positions never happened because Eisenhower made sure it never happened. But the planning existed. In late May 1945, Patton's staff drafted an operational outline code named Unthinkable, a name that would later be adopted by British planners for their own Soviet contingency that called for a three-pronged offensive launching from Bavaria, Thuringia, and the British sector in northern Germany. The plan estimated 14 days to break Soviet forward positions, 30 days to reach the Vistula River in Poland, 60 days to force a general Soviet withdrawal from Central Europe. Casualties were projected at 40,000 American dead, 200,000 wounded. Soviet casualties were estimated at 500,000, with entire divisions cut off and destroyed by maneuver warfare they couldn't counter. The plan was never formally submitted through the chain of command because Patton's operations officer, Colonel Halley Maddox, told him bluntly, "Sir, if you send this to SHAF, Eisenhower will relieve you tomorrow." Patton knew it was true. He filed the plan in his personal safe and went back to writing angry diary entries about missed opportunities. What Patton didn't fully grasp, what Eisenhower understood with painful clarity, was that wars are not fought in tactical vacuums. They're fought in political contexts, and the political context in 1945 made Patton's war impossible. The American public had supported World War II because Pearl Harbor made the threat undeniable and Hitler's atrocities made the cause righteous. The Soviets, despite their brutality, were allies who'd bled Germany white on the Eastern Front, saving countless American lives in the process. Asking American mothers to send their sons back into combat against those same allies, based on the argument that they might become enemies later, was politically suicidal. Truman knew it. Marshall knew it. Eisenhower knew it. Even Churchill, who privately despised Stalin and feared Soviet expansion, knew that Britain was exhausted and couldn't sustain another war. The only person who didn't seem to know it, or didn't care, was Patton. "I don't do politics," he told an aide in August. "I do war. And the war we need to fight is right in front of us." Eisenhower's strategy for managing Patton was a masterclass in leadership under impossible conditions. He couldn't fire Patton outright in May or June, when Third Army was still occupying Germany and the public still saw him as a hero. He couldn't let Patton continue advocating for war against the Soviets, which was undermining Truman's diplomacy and threatening the fragile Allied coalition. So Eisenhower did what he always did. He compartmentalized, managed, and waited for Patton to give him an excuse. The denazification comments provided that excuse. When Patton equated Nazi Party membership with American political affiliation, he handed Eisenhower a public relations disaster that had nothing to do with the Soviets. Ike seized it. Relieving Patton for the Nazi comments allowed Eisenhower to sideline him without making it about Soviet policy, preserving Allied unity while removing a ticking bomb from the command structure. It was politically elegant. It was also deeply cynical. Patton understood exactly what had happened. "They didn't fire me for what I said about the Nazis," he wrote to Beatrice. "They fired me for what I said about the Russians. The Nazi thing was just the excuse."
The scoreboard that Patton never got a run-up, the kills, the victories, the proof of concept, remained theoretical. But the scoreboard that did get run up, over the next 45 years of Cold War, vindicated his strategic instinct, even as it proved his tactical solution unworkable. Between 1945 and 1991, the Soviet Union and its proxies killed or enslaved millions. In the Gulag, in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in Afghanistan in the 1980s. The Iron Curtain that Churchill described in 1946 imprisoned half of Europe for 2 generations. The Korean War, sparked by Soviet-backed North Korea, cost 54,000 American lives. The Vietnam War, fought to contain Soviet-backed expansion, cost 58,000 more. The nuclear arms race consumed trillions of dollars and brought humanity to the brink of extinction during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Every one of these consequences flowed from the decision not to confront the Soviet Union in 1945, when America had maximum advantage and the Soviets had maximum vulnerability. Patton saw it coming. He tried to prevent it, and he failed not because his analysis was wrong, but because the political will to act on it didn't exist. The final irony, and it's an irony that military historians still debate in seminar rooms and war colleges, is that Eisenhower, the man who stopped Patton, spent 8 years as president managing the exact threat Patton had identified. President Eisenhower built NATO to contain Soviet expansion. He sent American troops to Lebanon and threatened intervention in Suez to counter Soviet influence. He authorized U-2 overflights to monitor Soviet military capabilities. He presided over the creation of the interstate highway system specifically to enable rapid military mobilization in case of Soviet attack. He rang the Soviet Union with nuclear-armed bombers and missiles, implementing a strategy of massive retaliation that Patton would have recognized and approved. Everything Eisenhower did as president was built on the assumption that Patton's warning about the Soviets was correct. The only difference was that Ike fought the Cold War with deterrence and containment instead of the preemptive strike Patton wanted. Whether that saved lives or cost lives is a calculation that depends entirely on what you think would have happened if Patton had gotten his war. The numbers tell part of the story. The Cold War, fought through proxies and deterrence rather than direct confrontation, cost roughly 2 million lives in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and smaller conflicts from Angola to Nicaragua. It consumed $6 trillion in military spending. It warped 2 generations of American foreign policy and domestic politics. But a hot war in 1945, fought with conventional and atomic weapons across the heart of Europe, would have killed millions in months. Soviet casualties alone, given the Red Army's tactical doctrine and American firepower, would have been catastrophic. American casualties, even with their superiority and nuclear weapons, would have run to 6 figures. Civilian casualties in a devastated Europe, hit by another wave of mechanized warfare and possibly atomic strikes, could have reached the tens of millions. Eisenhower looked at those projections and chose the Cold War. Patton looked at the same projections and said the cost would be higher if we waited. Both men were gambling with other people's lives. Both men were trying to save civilization, and neither man could prove the other wrong. The museum epilogue to Patton's crusade sits in the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in a display case that holds his personal effects from the final months of his life. There's the diary, where he wrote his blistering assessments of Soviet intentions. There's the map of Eastern Europe he kept in his quarters, marked with Soviet divisions in red ink. There's the draft of a speech he planned to give, advocating for eternal vigilance against communist expansion. And there's a letter, written 3 days before his car accident in December 1945, addressed to Eisenhower but never sent. The letter is brief, almost resigned. Ike, I know you think I've lost my mind. Maybe I have, but I've studied war my whole life, and I know what it looks like when an enemy is preparing for the next one. The Soviets are preparing. We're pretending. When the bill comes due, remember that someone tried to warn you. Next to the display case is a photograph of Patton in his Jeep, taken somewhere in Bavaria in the autumn of 1945, staring east toward the Soviet occupation zone. His jaw is set. His eyes are hard. He looks like a man who can see the future and hates it. The placard beneath the photo includes a quote from a Soviet general, Vasily Chukov, who commanded the forces that took Berlin. The quote is from his memoirs, published in 1960. Patton was the most dangerous American general. He understood that our ideology was incompatible with theirs, that one system would have to destroy the other. We were fortunate that his superiors did not share his clarity. If they had, the history of the second half of the 20th century would have been written very differently. It's an extraordinary admission. The enemy Patton wanted to fight acknowledging that he was right about the existential threat, right about the timing, and right about the opportunity. What Chukov doesn't say, what no one can say, is whether Patton was right about the solution, because the war Patton wanted to fight would have been a nightmare of industrial slaughter, a grinding meat grinder across Central Europe, where even American advantages in air power and logistics would have taken months to translate into victory. The Soviets would have fought with the desperation of a cornered regime, trading casualties at horrific rates, hoping that American public opinion would crack before Soviet defenses did. And in the background, always, would have been the shadow of the atomic bomb. The weapon Patton saw as a war winner, and everyone else saw as the end of civilization. How many cities would Truman have been willing to incinerate to push the Soviets back to their borders? How many American casualties would Congress have tolerated before demanding withdrawal? These questions have no answers, because the war never happened. Eisenhower made sure of that. The quiet genius of Eisenhower's approach, the reason he's remembered as a statesman and Patton as a warrior, is that Ike understood the limits of force. He'd spent 2 years managing a coalition of fractious allies, balancing competing national interests, learning that wars are won as much by politics as by bullets. He knew that America couldn't impose its will on Europe alone, that defeating the Soviets would require British support, French cooperation, a unified Western alliance that didn't exist in 1945 and wouldn't exist for years. He knew that the atomic bomb, far from being the miracle weapon Patton imagined, was a curse that would turn America into a pariah if used preemptively. And he knew that the American people, exhausted from 4 years of war, would not support another campaign fought on abstract fears about future threats. So Eisenhower chose patience. He chose containment. He chose to build the structures, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the nuclear umbrella, that would eventually win the Cold War without fighting World War III. It took 50 years. It cost trillions. But civilization survived. Patton never lived to see any of it. The car accident on December 9th, 1945, broke his neck and left him paralyzed from the neck down. He spent 12 days in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, dictating letters, receiving visitors, slowly dying from complications. He knew the end was coming. He told his wife, "I guess I wasn't meant to see this thing through." He died on December 21st, quietly, with Beatrice holding his hand. The official cause was pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. The unofficial cause, whispered in military circles for decades, was heartbreak. The realization that he'd fought his last battle and lost it to his own side. The conspiracy theories started almost immediately. Some of Patton's admirers insisted the Soviets had arranged the accident, that NKVD assassins had sabotaged his car or orchestrated the collision. Others whispered that American intelligence wanted him silenced because his advocacy for war was too dangerous. There's no evidence for any of it. The accident was investigated thoroughly. The other driver was an American truck operator who'd made a bad turn. The injuries were consistent with a low-speed collision and an unbelted passenger. Sometimes the banal truth is just the truth. Patton died in a traffic accident, as random and meaningless as a million other traffic accidents, except that this one killed the most aggressive general in American history at the exact moment when his aggression had become a liability. The final accounting of Eisenhower's decision to stop Patton comes down to a question no historian can answer definitively. Did restraint in 1945 save civilization, or doom it to 50 years of twilight struggle? The case for Eisenhower is that he prevented World War III, avoided millions of immediate casualties, and built the alliance structure that eventually defeated Soviet communism without nuclear war. The case for Patton is that immediate action in 1945 would have ended the Soviet threat before it metastasized, saved the millions who died under communist rule over the next half-century, and established American dominance when the cost was lowest. Both cases rest on counterfactuals, alternate histories that can never be tested. What we know is what happened. Eisenhower chose containment, Patton was sidelined, and the Cold War consumed 2 generations before ending in 1991 with the Soviet collapse. In the basement of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, there's a file marked Patton, George S. Jr., Correspondence and Memoranda, 1945. Inside are dozens of documents that were classified for decades and only released in the 1990s. Intelligence assessments of Soviet capabilities, operational plans for offensive action, cables to the War Department advocating for a hard line against Stalin. One document, stamped eyes only and addressed to General Marshall, lays out Patton's strategic vision in stark terms. We have defeated Germany. We face a more dangerous enemy in the Soviet Union. We have a brief window of opportunity to settle this threat permanently. If we do not act now, We condemn our children to fight this war under worse conditions. I request authorization to prepare Third Army for offensive operations against Soviet forces in accordance with attached operational outline. The request is dated May 18, 1945. Marshall's response, written in the margin in pencil, is 2 words: not approved. That margin note is the epitaph for Patton's final crusade. Not approved. Not because the assessment was wrong. Marshall and Eisenhower both believed the Soviets were a threat. Not because the plan was unworkable. American forces in 1945 could have executed it. But because the political will didn't exist, the American people wouldn't support it. And the risk of catastrophic failure outweighed the promise of decisive victory. Eisenhower understood this. Marshall understood this. Truman understood this. Patton never did, or never accepted it. And so the war he wanted to fight remained a ghost, a might have been, a historical counterfactual that scholars still argue over in academic journals and military history conferences. The last word belongs to Eisenhower, from his memoirs published in 1963, 18 years after Patton's death. Ike wrote with the measured tone of a man who'd made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. George Patton was the finest battlefield commander I ever knew. His ability to inspire men, to read terrain, to exploit enemy weakness was unmatched. But war is not only about battlefield victory. It is about achieving political objectives at acceptable cost. In 1945, the cost of war with the Soviet Union was unacceptable to the American people and the Western Alliance. George never understood that distinction. He saw the military problem and wanted to solve it with military means. I saw the political reality and knew that some problems cannot be solved by force alone. History will judge whether I was right. I believe I was. But I understand why George believed otherwise, and I honor his conviction even as I'm grateful his war was never fought. It's a generous tribute, and a sad one. 2 great generals, 2 opposite visions, 1 decision that shaped the world. Eisenhower won the argument. Patton lost his career. And the Cold War, Patton's nightmare and Eisenhower's chosen battlefield, ground on for half a century, killing millions, bankrupting treasuries, and nearly ending civilization several times over. Whether fighting in 1945 would have been better or worse is unknowable. What's knowable is that one general saw the storm coming and wanted to fight it immediately, while another general saw the same storm and chose to build shelters. Both were right. Both were wrong. And the tension between their visions, between decisive action and patient restraint, defines American strategic thinking to this day. If you love untold stories from history's darkest hours, subscribe and join us on the next mission through time.